Hello, I'm Chris Gladwin, the CEO of Ocient, and I'm excited to welcome you to our podcast all about hyperscale data that we call Big Bytes with Ocient. We began these conversations a couple years ago to explore the industries that are being transformed by compute-intensive, always-on analysis of large data sets, such as ad tech, gov tech, and more. This is, new record-setting, even history-making. I remember reading in high school about, steam engines and what people would do, or the cotton gin, or all these new technologies. I think what's happening now in big data analysis is going to be in the history books of the future. I mean, these are the most transformative, impactful things that people are building, some of the most transformative things. And with us, we've got a super special guest who I know is thinks of the world this way, because Harper and I are good friends, and we've talked about this stuff. Harper Reed has spent his entire career focused on these possibilities of bringing new technology into solving problems that transform people's lives and change the world. He's been at places such as PayPal and Threadless, and was the chief technology officer for the Obama campaign in 2012. As Harper mentions on his own website, the world is magical, the future is exciting, and I couldn't be more excited to talk with him today. Welcome, Harper.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm always excited to be here and chat with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, Harper and I, you and I have spent, hundreds of times just talking about like what's going on with technology. And one of the, the cool things about knowing you is, you always got kind of a world that you really are understanding what's going on. So maybe to get us started, tell us a little bit about your background, particularly as it relates to data and large data analytics. And when did you start realizing the kind of power that can come from technology that uses data in transformative ways?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time around data. I mean, I think many of us have. And when I was at the Obama campaign was really when I saw the magic, or what could happen, because I'd spent a lot of time around data that, like at Threadless, we had a lot of data, but it was just big enough to be annoying, but it wasn't actually that big. That just meant you had to be a little bit more deliberate about how you did queries, or you had to be a little more deliberate about the analysis, but you could actually do it pretty easily with just like normal tools. You had no issues of running into, you were not going to run into any limits of your software very quickly. Whereas on the campaign, we had a lot of data, and it was big and it was hard. And that was really where it got interesting, because then you have to start, in some ways, you end up in this thing where you're just developing around edge cases. You're running into a wall and you're fixing the wall, and you're creating this kind of world where you may not actually get to the thing you set out to do, because there's so many edge cases you're fighting around. And it's kind of this funny thing. But what the neat thing about working in a campaign, and I think this goes for any kind of campaign all across the world, whatever site you're on, or whatever thing you are, I've never worked in a more metrics-driven environment. And what that meant is that if you had 6 weeks to do something and that feature was going to take 7 weeks, you cut the feature. Yeah. Everyone agreed. And so there was never this kind of dilly-dallying about whether something should be included. It was so surgical that it allowed us to really focus on the metrics that mattered. And in our case, this was, will this get us votes? And so we would do things like experiment with really wild technology. We used LevelDB a lot to do some really neat analytics stuff. We used a lot of Vertica to do a lot of analytic stuff again, as well as just completely abused RDS on AWS. And one of the things that was really notable about that time is election day in 2012. 3 days before that was a big hurricane in New York that was coming straight for our data center in Virginia. And so we had to migrate everything over the weekend to a different data center just to make sure. But that's easy. That's actually easy. What's hard is ingress, which is something that you and I have talked about a lot. It's just a pain in the butt when you have a lot of data and you got to move it from point A to point B. And so it just became this thing of like, okay, even though we have all these fancy solutions like defining all of our infrastructure and code, all this neat stuff, you still have you still got to put that stuff down a pipe and hope it shows up at the other end, and it's going to take 2 days. And that's just, you can't speed that up. Like the pipes are a certain size and that's all we got. And it's like these kind of things really start my imagination going on what could we do instead? How could this be different? What can we do? And that was the first time when I really started thinking about big data and what was interesting, I think the key for me was it started not being big anymore. It just started kind of being the normal like table stakes of what you should have. And I remember this point where I realized that when we first started talking about big data in the mid 2000s, we were really talking about
Mm-hmm.
trying to get hard drives big enough. That was the problem. It was not querying. It was literally, can you store it? And then it became, okay, now can you query it? And obviously with, Hadoop, et cetera, that became easy. Like you could query it now. And then it was the next thing, so on and so forth. And now it's this funny place where a lot of our wildest dreams of that time period have come to fruition. And now we're like, oh,
Right.
now what can we do? And this is a really exciting time. I don't know if I would say that I never imagined it. I think that I never thought, I was always so in the weeds on the infrastructure side that I just never imagined what happens when you don't have to deal with that anymore.
Well, one of my observations, kind of watching you and the campaign team do its thing, was that you all took new modern technology that was being used on the commercial side, particularly with ad tech, being able to characterize a customer down to the individual and then to tune the message and then measure the result. That seemed like it was pretty new for a campaign, right?
Well, there's a funny thing about that, and I always think this is one of my favorite stories about both about innovation and about that time period. So we started, and I asked all my friends who were working in big agencies, all my friends who were working in big data stuff across the internet. I said, how do we solve these problems? And they'd give us a framework. Here's how we solve them. And then I got out and I told them our solution, which I thought matched what their recommendation was. And they're like, oh wow,
Mm-hmm.
you went way further than we did. That was theoretical for us. Like we've never actually done that. And that was a lot around the
Right.
micro targeting, a lot of the strategy stuff we were doing around that. Most of it we thought was best practices, but it was theoretical best practices that were focused on the future. You see all these presentations, these boardroom presentations from these folks, and they're saying, and this is what we can do. We thought that was what they were doing, and so we just built to that. But it turns out that actually most people weren't doing that at that moment. An example of this is a lot of our, micro targeting stuff, which now is,
Right.
A no-brainer. Everyone does it. But, we were doing things like I remember this one project that I really thought was cool where they had built a model where they would ingest a user's Facebook data and then build out their
Mm-hmm.
Facebook network and build out this huge network. And then they were able to look at all of the interactions that person had and be able to determine who we should recommend content to in that network. And this would be a very valuable thing for any kind of recommendation engine, but this was just to do who would be interested in healthcare content or who would be interested in, veterans content or whatever it might be. And then we would help them choose that person to recommend to. And there's a bunch of interesting learnings from this, like, what is more effective. But the real thing that was cool was it took a lot of technology. It was
Yeah.
so much work. I think we may have spent $25 million on
Yeah.
solving that problem. I don't actually remember the numbers, but it was something
Yeah.
shocking amount of money. And then at the end, you look back and you do the numbers and you're like, this may not have actually been effective.
Why do you say that?
Well, because what we found was we can rearrange what they call the face pile at that moment. And the face pile is the ordered list of your friends that you can recommend content to. And we can sort it based on who we think is going to have the most impact of that, or we can just ask you who's going to have the most impact. And like asking you might be just as effective as us crunching all these numbers and
Mm-hmm.
doing all this big data work. And it was this really interesting lesson of like, don't forget the user. Like you might just be able to ask instead of spending $20 million or $15 million to do this big data thing, what if you just asked the user to do it for you in their head? And it's this funny problem of like, when is it appropriate to use these things? And then what I think about a lot is sometimes we make these technology decisions, especially when it's hard because it's attractive and fun and like makes our minds spin. We're excited about revving our engines. but it might not be the best choice for the product.
So how do you think it's going down now? Because we're in a big
Well,
election year. Real money's going to get spent, like real money on this
yeah,
stuff.
it's getting spent as
Yeah.
well.
And so what do you think the state of technology is for these big national
Yeah,
campaigns?
great question. First of all, I don't know. Second thing is, the exciting thing is it's all public record. Well, not all of it, but a whole bunch of it for the campaigns is public record. But we don't have a lot of the, what do you call it? We won't have a lot of the super PAC
Mm-hmm.
spend or the dark money spend. And what we'll start to see, I imagine, my prediction here is that you're going to have a lot of vendors and contractors that are working for the campaigns, both because it seems, just from my 1,000 feet view, that they're trying to
Yeah.
keep things pretty tight. Smaller teams, in 2012 and 2016 on the Dem side, which is the only side I can talk to, both sides had larger teams and larger contexts. They had a lot of people there. And I would not say that they learned a lesson. I would say more their focus has been different. I do think that some people prefer smaller teams with more contractors. Some people prefer larger teams with less contractors. It kind of just depends on what you're trying to achieve. And I think in 2024, the game afoot is using vendors and contractors. So what that means is that the campaign itself, although we'll probably have analytics, we'll be
Right.
partnering with analytics teams. And that might be many teams. It might be one team. I don't actually know at this moment. We can see a little later in the FEC reports who they're paying money to. But it is interesting because that means that they won't have one centralized
Mm-hmm.
space. They will have many people who will be using a lot of technology to solve this problem. A lot of maybe duplicative things, but with different outcomes. And I think that's interesting. I would have actually
Yeah.
liked that, I think, when I was the CTO, because it would have been less of us having to
Mm-hmm.
do that groundwork and more of us being able to focus on the outcomes.
How do you think the technology's been changing, and
Yeah.
do you think AI is changing how they do it? Such as the one of the gazillion emails I get every day, they seem to be more and more AI generated.
Yeah.
Do you think that's kind of state of the art, that AI is really becoming a part of these campaigns?
So there's a couple things I think about when I get these emails. The first one is I always remember how aggressively metric driven everyone was. And what I mean by that is they would do so many tests before an email hit your inbox that you knew that when it hit your inbox, it was the best possible email by the metrics they were looking for, which
Mm-hmm.
largely was fundraising. And so what I imagine, and I'm projecting a bit here, and I might even be able to say I'm hoping this is the case. I imagine what the case is that they're testing a lot of things from human generated emails to AI generated emails to, a combination of the both. And the ones that are winning, they're sending to their universe. And what is exciting about AI is they can make those universes a bit more discrete, or maybe even a word there
Mm.
might be bespoke. Whereas before you would have, let's say you had a email list of 10 to 20 million people, you could do a few tests of a couple 100,000 people. You'd get a really good email list. You'd think, you'd have some confidence level of success, and you'd send it to the whole thing, and you'd have an expectation of the revenue from that email send. And that was a very nice process. And the people that did that were actually, I think, some of the most competent
Mm-hmm.
people on the campaign. There was a bunch of teams that I worked with where it was like it was like I was a human and I was with a bunch of gazelles and we were in a race.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, you guys are born to run, and I'm sitting here just slowly crawling. Like, it was like working with some of those folks was like some of the most impressive
Yeah.
people I've ever worked with in my life. And the email team was amongst that. And the reason for that is because you would have some 24-year-old woman who was a writer in college come and work for the campaign, and then she would write an email in the voice of, John Cusack or whomever, and it would generate $15 million. And you're just like, they just knew. My conclusion is that pairing that with AI, pairing that with a lot of this predictive um, stuff, let alone the Gen AI stuff, I think gives them the tools to just increase the
Yeah.
throughput of money there. to increase the revenue. And what I do know, or I hope this is the case, because if it's not, it seems like a missed opportunity, is that they're just measuring the crap out of it. And so they have this pairing of that. They're like, okay, let's do a like, Chris Gladwin, this is his demographic. This is kind of what he is into. This is what he's given in the past. Let's roll that all together. And here's the email we wrote, but let's make it personalized for this very specific use case. If they're making, $100 to $1,000, a person on average, or whatever it might be, or even $10 a person on average, making that one call to OpenAI is not going to break the bank, per email address. So like, there's a chance that they really could be doing some interesting stuff here, and they're very smart. And so I trust that they're doing interesting things. What has changed though since 2012, besides like 5 lifetimes of technology, I think is a assumption by all of us, especially the leaders, that this is just happening. Like, I would assume that people are using, like, if you start a business, you would assume that you're using email targeting tooling. You wouldn't just send an email to like 1,000 people randomly. You would be like, how are we going to test this? You would assume that people are doing A/B testing. We assume that internally, but I think now that's the table stakes. Whereas before, I think it was a little bit innovative. And so I'm very interested to see how that manifests. One thing, like my favorite thing after campaigns, and this goes back to this David Axelrod quotation, which I think, which you can apply to almost anything. I like to apply it to startups, but it comes from campaigns, which is you're never as smart as they say you are when you win, and you're never as dumb as they say you are when you lose. Because when you think of 2016, Trump used a lot, his team used a lot of Facebook, a lot of targeting on Facebook, hugely invested in the Facebook platform. And so all of the books afterwards were like, Facebook is the key to the future of politics. Whereas Hillary did a lot of really bespoke tech, some really neat app stuff. And they lost by such a thin margin. If there would have been 80,000 votes in the right place, we would be talking about app strategies today. And so I really want to recognize that we don't know what the right answer is, because technology doesn't really win these things. I think it's similar with business. Like, you have 2 businesses together, one might have better technology, but the other one might just have a better narrative. And like, big data can't help with a bad business.
Yeah, and that's another thing I'm curious to explore a little bit is, AI has had many revolutions before. This isn't the first one. And what I've always found, and I think you've seen this as well, is when you have truly disruptive technology, what it does is it enables new uses and new users. And that's amazing, because those new uses markets tend to be 10 times larger than kind of the prior uses markets.
Yeah.
But the challenge is it takes a long time to do something different, especially for the customer, and I guess I wonder in AI, most of what I've heard AI doing is like doing what we do better, which is great, and it's going to happen. But, what'll be really interesting are the things that AI does that haven't been done before. When you think about AI, what do you think are the kind of revolutionary new things that for the first time ever, people are going to be able to benefit from?
There's so many interesting things that are happening, and I actually think some of the things we're seeing are a bit emergent, which is kind of what you're getting at. What are the emergent things? And I think some of the things that we're looking at that we're kind of putting on the pile of this has been done before. I would imagine some like search products.
Yeah.
We think, oh yeah, but this is just like Google. It's just smarter. I actually think it's not that. I think when you look at something like ChatGPT, when I talk to people who are not technologists, about ChatGPT, and you ask them how they use it, it's sometimes wild. Like, they're using it not like they used Google. And I've been thinking about my personal uncomfortableness, or I guess discomfort with the text chat interface, and how that comes with my own preconceived notion about how this works or should work. But then I thought recently, I was like, that chat interface is how I started on computers. Like back in the day, it was just a text interface, and then later we added graphics as needed. And I think some of these interfaces are similar, where we're seeing emergent use cases, which in this case is like dialoguing with a computer, trying to get it to like help me with a thing. For instance, I went to a dinner party this weekend, and 100% of the recipes were made with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
That's weird. And they were all pretty good. It was fine. It was like great. It wasn't like no one was like, oh my gosh, what recipe is this? Share it. But everyone was. The question was why? Why did you feel the need for ChatGPT? And then when the host described, well, I was looking for healthy options, and I was able to just say, I want pudding, but I want it to be
Mm-hmm.
healthy. And the ChatGPT was like, here you go. Here's some chia seed pudding. Here's the ingredients. Here's how you make it. I feel like this is the stuff that's emergent. It's not so much that they were able to, you can obviously search Google and you can say like, Google, I want a healthy cornbread, something high in fiber. And it will give you a bunch of blogs or whatever, people who've invented that. But the idea of just saying, I want a healthy cornbread, something high in fiber. Oh yeah, and I have a lot of this one ingredient, and have it just be like, okay, cool,
Yeah.
here it is, with no, and then you can have a dialogue there, the talking back and forth. I think there is some emergent properties there that we shouldn't discount. Are very, very, just they're
Right.
so weird. And then the other thing is, I'm seeing a lot of entrepreneurs who are using this technology to get ahead in places where they would have had to hire someone, whether it's comms or like Instagram. A friend of mine was trying to find this very weird product that he has. It's totally off the wall, and he's trying to figure out a Instagram strategy. And and one of these AI tools just told him the strategy, and it's like, yeah, that's probably more information he needs. Now he can go double check it with a person, or just do it and see the results. He could probably pipe the results back into wherever he got it, and it happens. These things are really interesting because they are different than how we used computers before. And so then when I think, where does this lead us to? Is programming computers going to be chatting with the computer, like trying to coerce a certain outcome from it, which is very, very different than we've ever done before. And then you pair that with some really neat technologies. Like, I mean, I think, Chris, whenever I've met up with you over the last couple of weeks, I'm always like, what about vector search? Have you thought about vector search? I'm very excited about vector search. And the reason is, I think we've been talking about semantic search since I remember. And I did a lot of search stuff in 2001, 2002, in the early 90s or late 90s. A lot of stuff around search. And even then, we were talking about semantic search. How do we get semantic search?
Right.
And now it just is like default. You're just like, yeah, I want to search on concept. I want to search for socks, but I want the socks of a vibe.
Mm-hmm.
I want the socks to have the vibe of a campfire, and it's just like, here they are. And you're like, what does that even mean? Like, what does that, when you have conceptual search, when you have something where you can search on a concept and it will find similar things that have a vibe or a concept, what does that unlock?
Mm-hmm.
When you want to search on how you feel, like, how does something feel to you? What does that unlock from an interface? Not just in business or consumer. Like, I think it's across the board. It offers a lot of very strange interfaces that I don't think we have yet figured out. And that's just vector searches with a reasonable embedding model. And Google just released or just teased an embedding model for video. So how wild will that be about being able to do largely a semantic search or a similarity search across video?
Yeah.
Like, what does that open up for things like analytics for retail, or like, I want to find the customer that was trying. You're thinking about making your retail space more accessible, and you want to find all the videos of people who had stumbled or had a hard time walking or were in wheelchairs, etc. Like, now you just type that in and say, bloop, it's out.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this type of stuff is, I think, saying it's like similar to what was before is doing it a disservice, because it does offer us a chance to build just some of the weirdest
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, when you talk about feeling as a part of the experience of interacting with a computer, it really hasn't been, and that's new.
Yeah.
And it makes me
Yeah.
think of that example you brought up earlier about writing copy in the style of John Cusack as a way of making it feel more connected, and ultimately being more effective as a fundraising vehicle. And so I wonder, it seems like that, feeling just in terms of like typing text is one thing. Now you're talking video, but like the next level, is it going to be like your interaction is with people? It'll be an avatar in the form of John Cusack, let's just say.
Yeah.
And that, I guess that gets to, an ethical question. I've been intrigued by some of the lawsuits flying around in the AI world. Like, you can't use my way of thinking. You can't, if I'm an artist, like, my style of painting is my style of painting. And if you're going to monetize that, you got to pay me. So, as you start to think about AI and this future data, are these legit issues, and that we are really going to have to, pay people to use their name, image, and likeness?
It's a complicated question, and I'm going to tap back into my Obama era media training and say that's very nuanced. But I think the key that I like, there's a couple things I think about. The first one is if you want to see what the canary in the coal mine kind of regulation looks like, just track what Japan is doing. They basically said you can't copyright innovations that are generated with AI. You can't copyright art that's generated with AI. They're like, it's derived from a bunch of copyrighted stuff, so that means you can't copyright it. I think that's an interesting like flag in the sand. I don't know if that's where we will end, but I like that that's the start of the conversation.
Right.
And I think that's a good frame to just think through. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think a lot of the issues are honestly not about fair use. They're about consent. And I think that if we were to think about this less about you can't use this, more so ask and then pay them for it.
Right.
Like, for instance, there's a whole brouhaha about OpenAI using a voice actor that sounded an awful lot like Scarlett Johansson. And a lot of people alleged, you probably trained it off of her movies. Some people said, oh no, they're using a voice actor that sounds like her. It's completely coincidence. But I think OpenAI made enough, like what they call them, foot gun mistakes, where it seems like even if it was a voice actor, it seems like there was some negligence there. And it looks like they tried to get consent, but when Scarlett Johansson said no, they should listen to that.
Right.
Like, I think that's the key, is that there are many actors and actresses that probably would say yes, who we all love and adore, that might invoke the same emotion that Scarlett Johansson may for some people. And I think the answer is like finding the person that says yes, because people will say yes. That's the key. It's about consent. It's not about we shouldn't do it or we should. And I think that's for artists, that's for all of these things. When you see the people who get mad or the lawsuits, it seems to me that there was a breakdown in consent. Like, in many cases, it's like you asked, I said no, and you went ahead and did it. Like, imagine if it wasn't AI, we would all be like, yeah, that doesn't seem right. That feels wrong. And so I don't know why AI makes it different. So I just look at this as like, we need to develop a framework and a language around, hey, Chris, can I use your likeness for this? And you may say, well, no, unless you want to participate in this sort of agreement. Here's a default agreement on how we can use your likeness without, it's not forever. There's a termed amount of time. There's compensation and consideration for this. And then, if these things happen and this happens, like, this is the same thing as if you use the likeness of anyone and anything. Why is suddenly AI different?
Yeah. And we've seen this every time digital technology swallows a new type of content. These rules of the road need to be established. And you saw this originally with software. There was just this whole concept of like, I guess we're going to use copyright law, and treat it that way and use that structure. And then when, music, because I was involved in that at the Music Now, we did the first licenses for digital distribution. And, there are all these rules of the road that need to be set. And there's a range of choices for certain types of content. Like, if you're going to play something on a digital radio station, that's inside the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's pre-negotiated. This is how it works. If you want to, sell someone a song, you have to have a license to do that. You can't just go sell somebody else's music. But if somebody wants to put it in the public domain, here's a Creative Commons license. And, you see that. And it seems like that's about to happen or needs to happen in AI. Like, these are the rules of the road, and you can put your stuff in the public domain. You can license it. Here's some, ways it can be used that are kind of automatic. But that, that's going to require some legislation, and that often takes time.
Yeah. And I would even suggest that the U.S. kind of frame on legislation of technology is a bit behind and should be updated. And I'm not hyper pro legislation and I'm not hyper against legislation. I think regulation and legislation have its place. I don't want a heavy hand, but what I think was worse is no regulation or
Yeah.
legislation until we know what the answer is.
Yeah.
And that's where the US works, is they wait until all the information is known, then they make some broad proclamation. Um, Whereas when I talk to my friends who are politicians in Japan, for instance, many of them talk and think in an iterative way.
Right.
Here's the information we know now. Here's a regulation for now. If we learn more information in the future, we will change it and we will iterate upon it. And they almost have versions. Like this is version 3, 3, June 2024, whatever it might be.
Yep.
And I that's what we have to do, because what we have seen over and over again is that regulation is always behind. And what that allows for savvy entrepreneurs to do regulatory capture. It allows for consumers to be hurt, and then it all settles.
Yep.
And then we either have like one winner in the case of like an Uber, which is fine. I'm not against that. It's more so that a lot of people were hurt trying to figure out,
Right.
hurt not necessarily like their pockets were hurt or their wallets were hurt, but also some people were hurt, in the case of self-driving cars, etc. And so, it is just about like, I think we have to have a little more progressive view on how to make regulation and legislation quicker and more iterative. Or we're always going to be beholden to the technologists to define this. As a technologist, I'm not super worried about that, but as someone who lives in the world, I would probably prefer it to be a little more holistic and a little more, I don't know, I don't want to have a law that then we have to wait 20 years to fix. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and talking about being a technologist, I've seen your process at work, over the years, and there's a phase that you get into, which is I'm figuring out the new thing. I'm going to work on next, but you enjoy the process because it involves just getting exposed and learning about a whole bunch of stuff, even if you don't end up working on it.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question for you is, as a professional tinkerer, what are some of the things that you're kind of just looking at and learning about today?
Yeah. So I love that you mentioned my process. I have a lot of questions about my process recently as I'm on the verge of starting a new company, and I've been talking to a lot of friends about this. And quickly, my process is basically I just go in a room and I hack on stuff, and then I emerge with a company at some time later. And I hack on a lot of stuff. So right now, the things that I'm really excited about, I mentioned vector search. I think there's so many applications for vector search that we're not even really thinking about. You can cough near a computer with access to a vector database and make a photo similarity search. You can make search engines for PDFs. You can make so many interesting things that were almost inexplainably hard before. But that's just one part of it. I was thinking as we were talking about the emails, I was like, what if you went through and grabbed all of someone's LinkedIn posts, all their comments, etc., and then used, a vector search to kind of get a vibe of what they're talking about, and use that to communicate with them via LinkedIn to make sure you touch on their values, etc. Like you can start doing some of this stuff, and use AI and RAG to kind of do that. I think that's really interesting. We played a lot with that, just playing around. The thing that I did that I thought was the most interesting, though, was taking raw JSON objects and passing them to an LLM to then have the LLM kind of prosify it, turn it into spoken word, and then giving it like a theme or a tone. So for instance, turning a weather forecast from like raw weather data into like a Gen Z weather announcer type vibe. And that was really fun because what I found is that the LLMs are incredibly good. Any of them, it could be Llama to Mixtral to OpenAI, any of them locally or on a cloud are so good at interpreting JSON data or even structured data of any sort. But I use JSON because it's pretty verbose and just telling you what's going on. So here's an example. Every morning I get a alert. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. I get an alert on my phone that is a sleep coach that looks at the JSON data that came from my bed and it's just like, here's what it is. And okay, I don't have one. Do I have one? No, I don't have one up right now. And it just tells me, hey, here's what's going on with your sleep. Here's how you slept. This is what you need to work on. And it's pretty good. All I do is I pass it last night's sleep and I pass it the last week's sleep as JSON data. with a short prompt that's just like, you're a sleep coach. Please give this person advice on how to sleep better tomorrow. And
Yeah.
it does it in a very robust way.
And
And it's
what have you learned about your sleep?
I unfortunately need 7.5 to 8.5 hours of sleep a night. That's the thing
Okay.
I learned. And I am much more performant. Like last night, I got a lot of sleep. I feel great. I
Mm-hmm.
worked out this morning and it felt great. I was like, oh yeah, I could do more. That kind of workout where you're like, let's go. And like right now, I feel great. I feel great going into the afternoon. And that's, I think, 100% related to sleep. I didn't overeat before I went to bed. Like I drank enough water. I didn't get up and not like a lot in the night. I didn't toss and turn. Like I feel pretty good about that. And then what's interesting about this is a very simple product. Like this is not when I say product, I mean, I don't think there's a business here. I'm sure someone could make it a business. That's not what I do. But like the idea of just taking that blob and passing it to this amorphous box and having something come out that actually helps me do behavior change is really fascinating. And so I took that, and the next thing I did is I took my studio that I go to. I call it an office, but it really is more like an artist studio, to be honest. It's just a place to go and like paint on a canvas. The canvas happens to be a computer and programming languages, but the studio is wired aggressively with a bunch of sensors. So we have anything from environmental sensors to presence sensors to some really advanced ones like millimeter wave that help us know where people are, to all sorts of sensors, to weather alerts, to ambient. It's really fun. And then we have have a system that then collects all of that data and then passes it to an LLM at some cadence. And then we turn that into prose. And then I have the office talk shit about what's happening in the office. So I have it be very sardonic and have it actually talk out loud with a speaker where it'll just say, oh, the CO2 level has gone up. You're going to die soon, or whatever it is. That's not a good example, but it's very funny because it's a sarcastic view of what's happening in the office based on sensor data. And then what we did, which was another level, is we took the security cameras that are in the office and passed them through a multimodal model to create JSON representation of what's happening in the in the image, and then that's then passed to the same system. So it'll just be like, oh, a middle-aged man dressed in all black is standing there using his phone, and I'm just like, man, I'm right here. Like it's very funny. And this is something again that like I can't imagine how I would have built this 5 years ago. I just could imagine if you said, hey, you need to incorporate the cameras and have it actually talk about what's happening. And it's very good. It's very funny. And we built it for fun to see if it would work. And my takeaway from it was these LLMs are very good at interpreting raw data.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, much better than I would have thought. And I'm not even doing anything crazy about it, but you could imagine if instead of trying to make a sarcastic office, if you wanted it to alert you on things that were not normal. And so you said, here's steady state.
Right.
These are what our expected values are. If it's not expected, return this kind of value. And you could have that very easily build a security system that just takes a first pass on security cameras.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd want to test it. And then we have this process of, okay, it works. How do we make it cheaper? And that's been fun to learn as well about how do you make these LLM things more efficient? Is there a way to make a bespoke model after you've got it working? Is there a way to fine tune it to make it cheaper? We've done a lot of that fine tuning. That's been really cool. But mostly what this is about really understanding the very kind of padded walls that the LLMs are, and what is the world that you can bounce around inside there? What can you do? And most of it we do trying to be fun. The other thing we've done a lot of is controlling browsers and having it browse for you, which is another thing that is really bonkers because it can do very good.
Mm-hmm.
It can fill out forms, and like this is another thing that you just watch it, you're just like, wow, this weird computer is driving my computer. Like I'm not driving it. I just told it to do something. So imagine what this would do with accessibility, or could do with, like how we're thinking about it with shopping, or could do with like anything. Like how cool would it be if you were like, I want to fill out this form, but it's 5 pages long. You don't want to do anything. You're just like, fill out the form for me. You already have my data. Like just go.
Right. Figure it out.
Like figure it out. And it can figure it out. And there's some inefficiencies there. We're not quite there yet. And, I know you're not supposed to, personify or humanize these things, but it's fun too. And it's like, we're going to get, I think it's going to get weird is basically what I'm saying, Chris.
So Harper, when I hear you talking about all these capabilities, not just with data, but with AI and everything, one of the things that it seems is going to become the limiting factor is energy. The rate of growth of power consumption by these companies that are in AI is accelerating, and accelerating can't continue forever. I guess, do you see energy really ultimately becoming the limiting factor? It's not technology, it's not people. How much we can benefit from AI, do you think it ultimately becomes limited by energy availability?
I do. I think a lot about energy. I think a lot about what, like, just for example, there's a lot of problems that we're facing in the world, a lot of, you know, geo conflict, a lot of really kind of intense stuff happening right now. I think many of these problems are fixed if we have more energy independence. And I don't mean just the US, I think in general. When I think about the opportunities of fusion, which I have a lot of hope for, um, being able to unlock a simple path to power all of our wildest dreams is really important. And I, Chris, you know better than me, but um, we're on track to not power those dreams. We're on track
Yeah.
to cause many problems around, where we're going to say, do we want to power compute or do we want to power air conditioning?
Yeah. Or
We're
food.
or food or water purification or
Right.
whatever it might be. And like uh you see trends in the market like, Facebook doing a lot of really interesting stuff around trying to get a little bit more energy independent as a company, which is wild. You see a lot of interesting things around nuclear energy, etc. And I'm I'm very interested in that, but I really think we need to focus on the next step because focusing on the previous step or just making the previous version better, I don't think does it. I think we really need to focus on what is that next thing? How
Hmm.
does it work? How does it manifest? What is the next one? Fusion, etc. And I would love, my dream is that in the same way, I would love to, honestly, I want Akamai's original business model, but for energy,
Hmm.
where you have little tiny power plants all over the place and they power they power this block of 6 homes and they power this small data center. And you have that kind of, because we're going to need that. With that said, I'm also think that there's a lot of folks, Ocient included, who are focusing on how do we be more power efficient.
Right. That there
Um,
has to be.
you have to be, and you just see even with like the Hugging Face announcement today about powering a bunch of GPUs, like a GPU is not power efficient. But if unless you're doing deliberate work like Apple is doing to say with this laptop it has this many kind of
Hmm.
cores of compute, and it's very power efficient, that's where we need to go. We need to be thinking, I want a how much power per query type of experience with these AI stuff to just understand. I my last company did a little bit of work around crypto, and I spent a lot of time thinking about power usage there. And people would get to as discrete of a number as this is how much power is used for this thing. This when you do this is how much power is used. And I think we have to have that conversation. Otherwise, we're going to build something and we're going to come to this future where we're going to have to choose, food for people who are at risk or, doing cool image search. And I don't want that future.
Yeah, absolutely. The world is going to have to find solutions for energy
Hmm.
efficiency. Today, the demand for energy by data centers is doubling between every 2 and 4 years.
Yeah.
And at that rate of acceleration, it's just how many years until it needs a million times more power than it does today. And data centers already passed California. They're about to pass Brazil as a category of energy consumer. You can't have a million times more. So efficiency is going to have to be a part of the answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to everyone who's focused on that. Thanks for focusing on that, Chris.
Well, that's awesome. And I'm thrilled that we have the fully rested, energized Harper with us today. So I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks so much for taking the time. I'm sure everyone who listens to this is going to be thrilled by your restful enablement of insight. So thanks again. And I'd say to those listening, thanks for your time, for sharing the kind of conversations that are just so interesting. And you can always learn more at about Ocient at ocient.com, and you can listen to this podcast on all major platforms. Thanks, and until next time, I'll see you later.